everyone, hello, this is Ishtar with another episode of the Naked Shaman. Thanks for joining me today, and it's good to have you with me, and we're going to be talking about human sacrifice. Now, there's a very good reason for that, and that is that after last week's episode, I had a few emails and messages about my description of what we do with the bonfire when I referred to it as a bonfire. And I think some people thought, well, it kind of fed into this fear that has been put about for the last 1500 years about any kind of shamanic work, that it is about, obviously I didn't say don't put human beings on the fire when I was explaining that the bonfire was the Celtic name. It was called the bonfire, and they used to have it around this time of year. But I don't know if it was human bones or not, but I'm certainly not talking about putting human bones on the bonfire. When I did mine a few days ago, I was putting messages on pieces of paper and burning those pieces of paper in the fire. To me, the paper was the bones, and the writing were the messages that I was sending across into the other dimensions that come up with the smoke. It was mainly a form of thanksgiving, really. I was just giving thanks for everything. But I just it's good to get this feedback, because it tells me what the sticking points are in people's minds, because it's a long time since I've kind of been in the world where a lot of perhaps my listeners are, and so I want to know what the sticking points are. And I had completely forgotten this fear that Christianity has spread around about the fact that before Christianity there was human sacrifice, and now there's Christianity, it's all gone away. Well, this is a complete delusion, and it's also nothing to do with shamanism, you'll be glad to know. So I'm going to, in this week's version, set the record straight about all of that. And I'm also going to be talking about a very real human sacrifice carried out only in 1539, so that's really the sort of medieval times, and it was carried out by the Church of England here in Glastonbury. And so again, just to show you that human sacrifice did not end with Christianity. The abbot here of the Glastonbury Abbey's name was Richard Whiting. And it was a terrible ritual human sacrifice of the most bloody and brutal kind. They hung him on a cross on top of Glastonbury Tor with his two assistant monks on either side of him to represent a sort of pastiche of the crucifixion. Then he was dismembered while still half alive, and his body parts were sent to different Benedictine abbeys in the West Country. So much for human sacrifice ending with Christianity. I think, though, that was probably the last human sacrifice which the Christian Church in this country did out in the open. But we shouldn't be fooled. There's ever-increasing evidence coming out now, and witness statements pointing to the fact that it almost certainly is still going on today among some churches and some church clerics. Of course, it's in a much more covert way. But children are stolen and come back with stories about satanic rituals where there are bishops present and priests present. So it's beginning to seem like there's no smoke without fire. But even on the surface, if you just look at the surface where it's hidden in plain sight, we can see from the masses and holy communions, and the fact that Easter is the most important church festival in the ecumenical calendar, that the whole religion is based on the human sacrifice of a man who lived in Nazareth, Jesus Christ. and the distribution of the bread or communion wafers represents the body of Jesus Christ, which people are encouraged to eat, and the wine represents his blood. This is a magical ceremony, the Mass, which is carried out in Christian churches all over the world today, every Sunday. So I don't think it's just an empty ritual. Therefore, I don't believe that Christianity has in any way ended the need for human sacrifice among these certain perverted types of people who get their kicks that way. But if you go right back into the mists of prehistory, as we're going to do today, you'll find it wasn't the shamans who encouraged human sacrifice. It was, in fact, the smiths who came later with their strong storm gods and their secret guilds. And I have to declare a bit of an interest here because my DNA is 1/4 Smith. It's on my father's side, but his mother on the matrilineal side. And I take a special interest in the Smiths for this reason. This is why I have studied their history quite deeply, because I had to remove a curse from the family line, and I had to get right back to 2,000-3,000 years ago. And so I had to understand what the Smiths were and where they came from and what it was all about. And I did study this. So basically the Smiths took over from the shamans who were existing at a much, much earlier time. First of all, perhaps I should explain what is shamanism so you can understand the difference between a shaman and a smith. Shaman is actually a Siberian word, but it's quite simple really, though. All it means is someone who just gets guidance from the spirits or healing from the spirits and brings them this healing and guidance back to their community. These spirits are met in what we call journeying, which is a form of trance. We go into trance to the beat of a drum usually, and we get into other dimensions and we get guidance from those dimensions where the entities that we meet are almost timeless. Certainly they're living in a different time to us. So this is what shamans do. And I've been a shaman for a long time now, maybe getting on for 15 years now. And never once in all that time have I met a spirit who demands a human sacrifice or a sacrifice of any kind. The offerings that I give are purely out of love, and they take the form of flowers and herbs, and sometimes I put milk out. Different, there's very different things that you can give as an offering, but I do it because I feel such love and gratitude for the spirits that I meet, particularly the spirits of the earth, that I want to put out a little offering for them just to say thank you. This is completely different to sacrifice, and I'm going to come on to that. Sacrifice does mean to make sacred, but the way, and that's what an offering is, but in the way that sacrifice has become now, it's not at all about making sacred. It's about power. It's about the gaining of power over others, and this began with the Smiths. But before the Smiths, there were shamans all over the world that would guide their tribes, the tribes that they were in, or use this kind of form of journeying to bring back healing, or different things there's so many different forms of healing that shamans do. And the female shamans were also the midwives, and they were the handfasters who married the people, and they were also the psychopomps. So they would, I call it, sort of hatching, matching, dispatching. That was their role. And the psychopomps would carry the dead, the deceased at the time of death, to their next place in the realms of the dead, as we call it. There are so many different things. They do soul retrieval. They were the herbalists. They were the healers. And this was at a time when it was before the Metal Ages. And so it was a time of pottery, ceramics, tools. The tools were carved out of stone. And the Smiths began to come into prominence probably about 5,000 years before Common Era. So that's about 7,000 years ago. Because before the Smiths, there was metal of a kind, but it was the kind that came down from the heavens in meteorites. And that's why you often find as well, if you go back into prehistory, that meteorites were honoured in a kind of shamanic ceremonial form. I wouldn't say they were worshipped, but something like that, because they were considered to be a pure, unconditional gift from the sky gods. And the sky gods reigned. And this, and we don't really know how this happened, but the metal started to then become from the earth, telluric metal. And the first metal that was discovered was copper. And as I say, I think this is probably about 7,000 years ago. And so that's the sort of copper age. And then they discovered how to make bronze by mixing together copper and tin. And that was about we call the Bronze Age, from about 2,500 before Common Era to 800 before Common Era. And then it was around 800 that's when it turned into the Iron Age, because they discovered iron in the earth. So throughout this time, the Smiths started to gain in prominence and started to form themselves into guilds. Rather like the Masons today, these guilds were secret. And they had secret rituals in their guilds that only the cognoscenti knew about. And they started to come into power more over the shamans. And so we see the shamans fading out of importance around that time. This Bronze Age is about the same time as these megalithic stone circles, such as Stonehenge was built and Avebury in Britain. But they were built all over the world, and they were built by the Smiths. So the Smiths eventually took over in power from the shamans, and they brought in their own gods. So no longer was it the wonderful gifts raining from the heavens, from the sky god. Their god was the storm god, the thunder god. And you see this in myths all over the world, this change from, if you study the Vedas, you can see it in the Vedas, you can see it in the Greek myths. The further back you go, you've got the sky god, and then it changes gradually into the storm god. So, for example, in the Greek, it's Zeus is the storm god, and then in the Indian Vedas, it was Deus who was the sky god, and then it became Indra, the storm god, who was suddenly much more important than the sky god. And this is also known as the strong god, because this strong god demanded a sacrifice. He, according to these secret guilds of smiths who wanted to get power from the shamans. And so they told the people that you can't get something for nothing. And so it became an exchange. Rather than the offering where it's given freely in love, it became more a required price to pay, which is totally different. Has a totally different feeling to it than a free offering. So around this time when I was studying this, I very luckily came across, I already knew about Mercier Allier because I'd read his book on shamanism, which is the be-all and end-all. If you want to get a book on shamanism, I'll put a link to it at the bottom. But this is a different book of his. He was the late professor of the history of religion at Harvard. He was writing around the 1950s. And what's so great about his writing is that he understood about shamanism. So he writes about religious history from the point of view of how it related to shamanism. And, you could probably read other histories elsewhere about the history of metallurgy. But I doubt you'll find anyone looking at it from a shamanic point of view and seeing this power struggle that took place, which is very evident if you understand about shamanism and you know how to read myths. And Mercier Allier did. So in his book, it's called The Forge and the Crucible, the origins and structures of alchemy. I'll put a link to it at the bottom. So he describes this process as follows. All the mythology woven around agrarian fertility, metallurgy and work is of relatively recent origin, of later date than pottery and agriculture. Metallurgy is set in the framework of a spiritual universe where the God who is still present in the ethnological phases of food gathering and small game hunting is finally ousted by the strong God, the fertilizing male, spouse of the terrestrial great mother. This is when we start to see patriarchy coming in as well, because the most of the shamans it's turning out were women. But the Smiths were much more into this strong male god who was the husband or the spouse of the terrestrial, the earthly great mother. He goes on, it is known, of course, that on this religious plane, the conception of creatio ex nihilo, that means creation from nothing, accomplished by a supreme heavenly deity, has been overshadowed and superseded by the idea of creation from hierogamy and blood sacrifice. We pass from the idea of creation to that of procreation. He goes on, this is one of the reasons why, in the mythology of metallurgy, we come up against the motifs of ritual union and blood sacrifice. It is important to grasp the idea, the significance of the novelty that creation is affected by immolation and self-immolation. Previous mythologies only knew of creation ex nihilo, or from some primordial substance fashioned by God. The making of the blood sacrifice into a condition of creation, cosmogony as well as anthropogeny, reinforces not only the homologies between man and the cosmos, for the universe itself derives from a primordial giant, a macranthrope, but also introduces that idea that life can only be engendered from another life that has been immolated. These kinds of cosmogony and anthropogeny will have considerable consequences. The stage will be reached where creation or fabrication will be inconceivable without previous sacrifice. And so this was the religious idea of the Smiths, and it's they that brought it in. Nowadays, when it goes on, it's difficult to say what the reason for it is. I've heard many different reasons. Someone even said to me, this will make you laugh. Someone even said to me, well, they have to have human sacrifice because there is this real awful monster who lives under the earth, and if he's not fed with the blood of children, he's going to come up here and create havoc. I mean, I can't believe the fairy tales that people believe, honestly. And so I did actually say to him at that time, I said, look, just bring him to me, whoever he is, and I'll sort him out. And I did say, have you actually seen this monster? Oh, no. Of course he hasn't seen this monster because it doesn't exist. But I think this is a kind of backstory that some of them are getting in the modern day guilds, which are mainly Masonic. Another one is that there are ETs out there that demand the blood, something in the blood of our children. Well, I think that's just as likely as the monster under the earth, quite honestly. I actually think they're just very sick people that like to kill and torture children. That's sort of the only conclusion that I can come to, but you can make up your own mind. And because of this, because we haven't really, we've got all this sacrifice going on that nobody talks about, or if anyone does come forward and try to talk about it, they're told they've got false memory syndrome. It's just denied and shoved under the carpet. And this, the father, the patriarch, the strong God, he's now become a sort of Bluebeard character, which is the dark side of man, which is running rampant. And this is the direct result of our ignorance, because all these rooms in Bluebeard's castle the family home. They're the rooms we're not allowed to look into. So, this sacrifice is carried on, and it's no different to when the Smiths first took over from the shamans. And as I say, there was a most gruesome one that happened in Glastonbury. We every November we do a vigil actually to remember Abbot Richard Whiting, and I think we're doing it in a couple of weeks actually. And we meet in the middle of town, and then we lay flowers, and then we walk up to the Tor to honour his memory, because it was the most, to think that this went on in front of people, it wasn't hidden, that King Henry VIII's men came and took him, and then he was taken through the town, he was dragged through the town, up the hill, on a horse-drawn hurdle, and then up to the summit of the Tor, where he was hung on a gibbet with two monks hanging either side of him, like the two thieves at Calvary. The bodies were then cut down while still half alive, and then taken to the White Spring at the bottom, and they were drawn and quartered so that their red blood flowed into the White Spring. Now, anyone who knows anything about alchemy will understand how massively symbolic that was. It wasn't just a murder, it was a black magic rite. And then the various parts of his body were sent to 4 separate abbeys in this area. They went to Wills, Ilchester, Bath and Bridgewater, and his head, with his testicles stuffed into his mouth, was hung on the main west gate of the abbey as a warning, I suppose, but a warning to who? We don't know. It seems to me that he was an alchemist, and in those days alchemists were either on the side of the king, or they were jailed, or they were killed. You couldn't be a freelance alchemist. And it's my impression that he was hung and drawn and quartered, and that was, and as I say, put up as an example, so that anyone thinking of practicing alchemy would think twice at that time. But it's not much different now. It is, it's the same thing that goes on, and it's about power, and it's always about power, and it's not about anything else. Think of the bloodletting that goes on even in the open. Even in the open, how much blood have they spilt just in the last few years? On 9/11, thousands were offered up. And the Iraq War of 2003, mounted on the fake pretext, a deliberate fake pretext of weapons of mass destruction, saw the wholesale murder of more than 1 million non-combatant, that means ordinary men, women and children, Iraqis. You can go back even further. More than 16 million were killed in World War I, more than 60 million in World War II. Neither of these wars needed to have happened. They weren't an accident, they were deliberately contrived. So by keeping us in ignorance about this ongoing human sacrifice, which, by the way, they will be celebrating again on November the 11th with their Remembrance Sunday, their Poppy Day, it just makes it so much easier for them to carry on with their piling up of the sacrificial victims on these great tottering funeral pyres of wars and false flag terrorism, not to mention the children sacrificed in their black rites. So what we are missing, in other words, is gnosis. And gnosis is knowledge. It's a Latin word for knowledge, and it's also aligned to wisdom. Without this wisdom, without this gnosis, we are ignorant and unwitting victims of those who do have gnosis, who have the full picture, and who keep us moving all the time, harrying us off our lands and away from our own indigenous ancestral wisdom. We need to wise up to this. This is what wisdom really means. We can only confront and deal with the dark side of others by fully recognizing and knowing our own. We can only do this by acknowledging and interacting with and within all dimensions that are present here, by learning how to communicate with the entities that people these dimensions, as our earlier ancestors did through the shamans before the time of the belief in the strong male god and his demand for blood sacrifice. This creation comes about not through sacrifice, but through ecstasy. As Peter Kingsley writes in A Story Waiting to Pierce You, cultures are created and destroyed in ecstasy, and that is the breath of ecstatics that keeps a world alive. The ancestral spirits, who we can contact much more easily over the next week or so, because the liminal walls between the dimensions are thinner, will teach us how to become whole again, or become adults in this rite of passage once we're in contact with them again. They're already starting to teach me in this way, and this is what I'm trying to pass on to listeners here: the way to ecstasy, wisdom, and full gnosis. Most of my work now is helping to underpin that effort by getting us back in touch again with the spirits and our earliest ancestral wisdom. I must say, with the rebirth of the divine feminine that's becoming more and more obvious to me every day, I believe the days of the strong God and the sacrificial lamb are reaching their end. It won't happen overnight. It's going to take many generations, but we will be returning over time to a more loving and generous partnership of a true alchemical and happy marriage with the spirits of the land. So I hope that's cleared up a lot of those questions that I received. If it hasn't, or you have more questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I want to know what doesn't make sense, and I'm happy to address it here. If you liked this, then please give the like button a click on the way out, because that tells YouTube to distribute this video more widely. Or if you want to hear more, please subscribe. And thanks very much for listening. Enjoy your bonfires. Bye for now.